Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking some absolutely incredible historical sources and turning them into a journey. We're tracing the epic, 5,000-year story of how our modern interconnected world actually came to be. We're diving into the history of a concept we talk about all the time, but honestly rarely understand in its full historical context.
Let's kick things off by challenging something we all kind of assume. Is globalization really just a modern corporate buzzword? Like, is it just about the internet, multinational corporations, and massive shipping containers? Or is it something far more ancient? It's so easy to think our hyper-connected world was born yesterday, but the historical sources tell a completely different and frankly much more thrilling story.
Okay, let's dive into the core idea here. Globalization is definitely not a single recent event. It's actually a relentless, centuries-long chain reaction of human connection. It's this incredibly long historical process where trade, migration, capital, and technology have interacted over hundreds and hundreds of years. And what's absolutely crucial to grasp right out of the gate is that this process produced immense opportunity and prosperity, sure, but also severe coercion, massive inequality, and devastating crises.
So here is our roadmap for the explainer. 1. Before the modern world. 2. The 19th century transformation. 3. The interwar crisis. And 4. Rebuilding the global economy.
Starting with part 1. Before the modern world. Silk, cowries, and spaghetti.
It's honestly mind-blowing just how far back this goes. I mean, we're talking 3000 BCE, and coastal trade was already booming, linking the Indus Valley civilizations with West Asia. The source material highlights that cowrie shells from the Maldives were actually circulating as currency as far away as China and East Africa. No way, right? And of course, we have the legendary Silk Roads. But these weren't just dusty paths for moving Chinese silk, Indian spices, and gold. They were literally the original information superhighways. They carried Christian missionaries, Islamic preachers, and Buddhist ideas across vast continents, seamlessly blending economic trade with deep cultural exchange.
In fact, our very food is physical evidence of this ancient cultural contact. Take spaghetti. Yeah, spaghetti. The historical origins are actually totally up for debate. Did noodles travel west from China, or did Arab traders bring pasta to Sicily? The exact path might be lost to history, but that uncertainty itself proves just how long-distance cultural exchange has been happening. It's like our pantries are essentially museums of ancient global trade.
But, as the world essentially shrank in the 16th century with European sailors crossing the Western Ocean to the Americas, this new connection brought unimaginable devastation. European diseases, especially smallpox, became the ultimate devastating tool of conquest. Because indigenous American populations had zero immunity, smallpox spread like wildfire. It actually often moved ahead of the military armies, killing whole communities and completely breaking down resistance, which just cleared the path for European conquest. Globalization, even back then, had a profoundly dark side.
Which brings us to Section 2, the 19th century transformation, boom and coercion.
Watch how these dominoes fall. It started with British population growth and industrialists basically pushing the government to abolish the corn laws, which had been restricting corn imports. Once those laws were scrapped, cheaper food imports just flooded into Britain. Domestic British farming couldn't compete at all, so workers migrated to the cities or moved overseas. To feed this massive new demand, vast, sweeping lands in places like Eastern Europe, America, and Australia were cleared. So out of a single domestic policy change in Britain, a truly global, highly complex agricultural economy was born, permanently moving food production thousands of miles away from the person actually eating it.
And you've got to look at the sheer human scale of that economic shift. 50 million. Let that sink in. Nearly 50 million Europeans emigrated to places like America and Australia during the 19th century. They were packing up and moving across oceans looking for a better future. But they were also providing the massive global labor force needed to build the new railways, the ports, and the farms that propped up this rapidly expanding global food network.
Now, here's where we see a really stark contrast between the colonizer and the colonized during this massive boom. While Britain aggressively expanded its industrial manufactures and established itself as the absolute center of global investment, colonial India was forced into a completely different role. Because British industrialists demanded protection, Indian manufactured textile exports declined sharply. Basically, India was forced to de-industrialize. They had to shift to exporting raw materials like cotton, indigo, and opium, becoming fully integrated into a system designed purely to serve British economic interests.
And the dark side of this growing global network is literally perfectly captured by the story of Rinderpest. It was this fast-spreading cattle plague.
In the late 1880s, infected cattle were imported from British Asia for one simple reason: to feed Italian soldiers who were invading Eritrea. But those cattle brought a plague to Africa that systematically destroyed traditional livestock-based livelihoods, forever altering the continent's entire social and economic structure.
The devastation here was staggering. 90% of Africa's cattle were wiped out by the disease along its path. Because traditional livelihoods completely collapsed, colonial powers and mine owners were easily able to monopolize the very few cattle that were left. This effectively forced Africans who had previously been completely sustained by their own land and livestock into the colonial wage labor market on plantations and deep in mines. It's a chilling example of how a biological disaster became a tool for absolute economic control.
Moving right along to Section 3, the interwar crisis, mass production to massive depression.
It's like a tale of two completely different worlds. The First World War was this brutal industrial slaughter that left 9 million dead and Europe heavily in debt to the US. But across the Atlantic, America experienced a massive consumer boom in the 1920s. This was fueled by Henry Ford's assembly line mass production, his incredibly famous $5 daily wage, and the widespread adoption of buying durable goods on credit, the hire purchase system. Almost overnight, the US became the world's largest overseas lender, aggressively exporting capital to prop up European recovery. But, as you probably guessed, this fragile, credit-fueled system completely shattered in 1929. It created the ultimate perfect storm for the Great Depression. You had agricultural overproduction driving prices straight into the ground, a heavy global dependence on U.S. loans, and then a sudden, panicked withdrawal of that U.S. credit. This just cascaded into massive banking collapses. Over 4,000 U.S. banks closed by 1933, and it triggered crippling global protectionism as countries desperately threw up trade barriers to save themselves.
To really grasp how deeply integrated the global economy was by this point, we just have to look at colonial India. When global trade collapsed, the price of Indian raw jute, which was used to make exportable gunny bags, plummeted by over 60%. Farmers who had borrowed money just to expand their output suddenly faced falling prices and crippling debt. It got so bad that peasants were forced to burn through their life savings, mortgage their land, and sell their precious metals and jewelry just to survive. An economic crash on Wall Street directly starved farmers in Bengal. It's all connected.
Finally, Section 4, Rebuilding the Global Economy, Bretton Woods to today.
Coming out of the ashes of the Great Depression and the Second World War, global leaders realized, okay, we desperately need a structured, managed system to prevent another catastrophic collapse. So in July 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, they established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They set up a system of fixed exchange rates that were pegged to the US dollar, which was in turn anchored to gold. And this framework launched an era of unprecedented growth in trade and incomes for Western industrial nations from the 1950s onward, eventually paving the way for the massive rise of multinational corporations. But there was a pretty glaring issue here. As former colonies in Asia and Africa finally gained their independence after World War II, they inherited massive poverty and an international economic system that had been built pretty much exclusively for Western industrial powers. So in response, they formed a coalition called the G77. They demanded a new international economic order, basically insisting on real control over their own natural resources, fairer prices for their raw materials, and genuine development assistance.
Fast forward to the 1970s, and the economic landscape basically gets turned on its head again. The US dollar weakened under heavy financial pressures, and that Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates finally collapsed, getting replaced by the floating rates we know today. Concurrently, those multinational corporations, desperate to cut costs, began aggressively relocating their manufacturing operations to low-wage countries. This sparked the rapid economic transformation of countries like China, India, and Brazil, cementing them as the massive Asian manufacturing hubs of our modern era.
And that massive shift brings us right to the present day. It completes our epic map. We've traveled from the ancient, dusty exchange of silk and spices through the devastating spread of disease and the sheer coercion of colonialism, past the buzzing assembly lines of Henry Ford, all the way to our modern, everyday reliance on floating currencies and highly complex global supply chains. It is a continuous, unbroken chain of cause and effect. Looking back at 5,000 years of mind-blowing wealth creation right alongside devastating exploitation, I've got to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. Have the demands of the G77 for a fairer international economic order truly been realized today? Have we actually learned the lessons of our highly interconnected past, ensuring prosperity without coercion? Or are we just rearranging the dominoes for the next generation? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the world around you, and I'll catch you next time.